Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest. Aviva Klompas is the co-founder and CEO of Boundless, which is a nonprofit in the U.S. that works on anti-Semitism and Israel, working for Israel, and I'll ask Aviva about that soon. Aviva has her podcast, which is called Boundless Insights, surprise, surprise, with Aviva Klompas. Viva has made a name for herself as an outspoken advocate for the Jewish people and a leading Israel educator. And if anyone wants to see, Aviva is very big on Twitter. That's how I got X. That's how I found out about her. Her information and her feed is something that anyone who loves Israel and wants to know what's happening should follow her. And also, Aviva, just remind me, you were also very in the Israel UN mission. I think, if I remember correctly, during Run Pros Or, which was the ambassador to the UN of Israel. You were his speechwriter, I think, right?
That's
and
right.
So basically, you're someone who knows what's going on in a lot of different fields that have to do with what's going on today. So it's an honor to speak to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Aviva, we're crazy times. We're talking a day after the election in America, although that's not our issue, but just the world's crazy. We're more than a year after October 7th. And as someone who knows about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias and all this kind of stuff, when October 7th happened, what happened in America? Why did we see suddenly this explosion of, everywhere you go? I was just in New York about a month ago, and I was walking by where NYU is, and suddenly there's like 1,000 people protesting against some Jewish sorority or something. I don't remember anything like this happening in the US or in the West in general.
Yeah. When I reflect on the past really 14 months since October 7th, it has been a surreal experience. So first of all, on October 7th, as Americans came to understand, as American Jews, I should say, came to understand the full scope of the horror of what had been perpetrated against Israelis in southern Israel, there was this terrifying realization. And I don't think that we were able to put that into words for a while. But now when I reflect on it, what I think that terrifying realization is that it could have been us. We don't live in a kibbutz in the south of Israel, and we may never see ourselves dancing at a music festival in the desert, but none of those details matter to the terrorists who invaded Israel, right? They didn't care where you lived. They didn't care about your nationality. They didn't care about your religion. They didn't care if you back a two-state solution. They didn't care if you voted for Netanyahu and his government. None of that mattered. What mattered was the fact that you had a connection to Israel. That was enough to cost you your life on October 7th. And here in the United States, what we've seen is that having a connection to Israel, which is intrinsic to our Jewish identity, is enough to cost you your way of life. Because how long did it take after October 7th before we saw mobs marching through the streets here calling to globalize the Intifada? How long did it take before people were running out to tear down posters of hostages, people who would never dare to tear down the poster of a missing pet, but saw no problem tearing down posters of babies and grandparents being held hostage by a terrorist organization? It's a perverseness, a sickness in society. And that was happening. It was weeks before Israel actually launched its ground invasion. That happened well before that. So as mere fact that you sort of ripped off the Band-Aid, this opened the Pandora's box to allow this simmering anti-Semitism that had been bubbling under the surface and allow it to explode. And what we've really seen in the past year is the mainstreaming, the normalization of anti-Semitism in America. A type of hate that was once limited to the fringe has moved firmly into the mainstream. And we see that on social media, certainly, but in academia, and very scarily, even amongst elected members of Congress.
So one of the things that I remember growing up in New York was we always knew that anti-Semitism in its most rabid form was a right-wing thing. We knew there was the like neo-Nazis and the fringes, and everyone knew there were like crazy people, like you just said, on the fringes. They weren't, there was stories in Skokie in the past and all these weird things, but it was never a mainstream thing. And it was always on the right more than on the left. And then suddenly we saw, I think on October 7th, it came out in its most disgusting form. It came out that there's a sort of like intellectual anti-Semitism, that it's like you say it in a nice way, you use very, deep terms, intellectual, academic terms, and yet it's basically the same thing. And you go to university and you meet professors that are happy about October 7th. And we met students not too long ago in Colombia, and they have professors that were celebrating what happened. How do you combat that? Because when it was on the fringes, it's very easy to combat. So explain to us.
So some of the work that's being done by my nonprofit, which is called Boundless, is really research into what anti-Semitism looks like and how it manifests. So as you say, for the most part, people are quite familiar with anti-Semitism that looks like anti-Semitism from the Holocaust era. So a swastika or a Hail Hitler salute or something like gas the Jews. People get that that is anti-Semitism. What they don't get is when it's cloaked and masked in this sort of political language of, let's say, Zionism. So even before October 7th, my organization Boundless had done a study. And what we were doing is mapping the relationship between what we call weaponized language. So that's language appropriated from the human rights discourse, where it's supposed to have legal meaning and weight, words like apartheid and genocide. But those words have been appropriated and weaponized to use as tools to demonize Israel and to vilify Jews. And so we did a study that showed how surges in weaponized language on social media would map, if you put them on a map of the United States to show where those surges in language were happening, it's the same places where you see protest activity on the streets, and it's the same place where you see higher incidents of anti-Semitism being recorded, meaning there is a very clear relationship between that weaponized language and anti-Semitism. And it's not enough to go to elected officials or to go to law enforcement and say there's this relationship. You have to bring data to them so that it can inform policy and legislation. And that's really the work we're doing at Boundless.
But Aviva, just to understand what you're saying, are you saying that in a way in America there's more of this type of rhetoric that's so, obviously hateful to Jews and to Israel, and the more, people who are considered more intellectual, people with college degrees, people who are in universities, rather than maybe people in the rural areas that are less, I think more people don't go to college than do go. So can we say that there's more now anti-Semitism on the intellectual side of things?
I'm not sure about that. I would certainly say there's plenty of anti-Semitism on the political right, and there is anti-Semitism on the political left. Those are certainly the case. The point that I'm making is that they look differently. And most people are pretty tuned into how it looks on one side, and so they're ignoring half of the picture. And our work is to make them see the entire picture in order to safeguard Jewish communities.
But one of the things that we keep on seeing on social media, and I'm pretty sure that also I saw it by you, and you mention it a lot, is the absurdity of a lot of these claims. Meaning, you'll have groups that are for LGBTQ rights, and they're marching in the same marches with, Hamas supporters or even Houthi supporters or Hezbollah supporters, and you'll have people who are very pro, human rights and the rights of the minority communities, and they're marching with people who are again killing people who leave the Muslim religion. And how do you, first of all, how do you explain just is it just stupidity, ignorance, or is there something more sinister behind it? And how do you combat that?
For sure, it's a failure in education. And I say that in terms of, first of all, people don't know what Zionism is. We just did a study at Boundless, and it's only 1/3 of Americans will say that they know what the word Zionism means. And when you go and you push them, it's actually less that really understand. I mean, 1/3 think they understand what it means, but the number of Americans who actually understand what Zionism is very, very small. And the problem is because they don't understand, they are believing the rhetoric. And that rhetoric is coming from a lot of places, from bad actors, from supporters of terrorists, from foreign intervention. And that rhetoric says that Zionism is white Jewish supremacy, which of course it is not. But people are believing that. And in America, where you have this framework of race and superiority and inequality, that is feeding into that framework and creating a narrative about who is oppressed and who is the oppressor. And it's painting Jews and Israelis and quote Zionists in this misunderstood way as oppressors. And if you understood some real facts, some real knowledge about the history of Judaism, about its connection to Israel, about what Israel actually looks like and how diverse it is, of course, that is all absurd. But that level of education doesn't exist here in the United States.
Right. And one of the things that not too long ago we saw, and I blame the media a lot for it, because I'll just give an example. You obviously know about this, and I think maybe I'll just ask you about a specific case. There's an author called Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he came for like a week to Israel, and he wrote this whole manifesto basically saying that Israel is like the new Nazi state. And then he comes and writes his book, and he's like an oracle, and you can't question him. And on CBS News, he goes on the morning show, and one of the reporters dares to challenge his views, and he gets this whole reprimanded in front of the whole audience, in front of all the workers. He has to apologize. Like he did this major thing. So maybe what what can we learn from such a subject? Do you think that there's a lot of reporters maybe that look at this and say, maybe we shouldn't get into it, maybe we shouldn't, tell even the truth because they could attack us later?
For sure, I think a lot of people think that, and you really gave the answer in how you framed it, which is that a guy goes to Israel and the West Bank for 1 week, and he thinks that he's qualified to write an entire book on the subject matter. We have thousands of years of Jewish history. It's an absurd notion. If either of us were to go to some country that we'd never been to before, spend a week there, and think that we could write a book on it, that would be galling, and nobody would accept that. But there's always this intrinsic bias that exists when it
Yeah.
comes to Israel. Now, certainly, I think that it's gone off the rails, but in some ways, I actually see that the election in the United States, when we look at, how the pollsters got it wrong again, is that I think Americans are inherently very decent people who are extraordinarily troubled by this perversion of truth and this perversion of reality, this distortion of reality. And in some ways, I think the election is actually a response to that, to say, let's bring some sanity back. A journalist should be able to ask the very basic questions that were asked in that interview. There was nothing untoward about them. And the
Yeah.
notion that it pokes holes into this idea of who is oppressed and who is oppressor, that should be somehow criticized, is really just unreasonable.
Yes. And I just want to say you were at the UN for, maybe let's ask one more question. The fact that Israel is looked on, especially in these intellectual circles, I keep on going back to that because we all know what, like you said, what anti-Semitism on the like extreme right is. We all know what neo-Nazis look like. We all know what skinheads look like. We need to obviously call it out, but it's obvious. What we see on the other side is like sort of a whitewashing of things that should be obvious, which is why we should be talking about it. And one of the things that they keep on bringing up is the oppressor versus oppressed thing, and that Israel is the white colonialist oppressor, and then I have friends who are Ethiopian Jews, or even Arab people who served in the IDF, and I wonder if you were maybe privy when you were in America, when you are in America, to maybe see, for example, an Ethiopian Jew, Israeli, that comes to talk with these people. The cognitive dissonance seems to be it has to be very weird.
Yes, absolutely. It's undermining what their core belief system is. And it speaks to the need to really be able to educate about what Jewish life is, what Zionism is, and what Israel is. And this notion that Israel is a barren wasteland of desert, or that it is nothing more than a conflict, or that the Jewish people are nothing more than the Holocaust, we have to really examine how we're talking about and educating about Jews in Israel if we're going to hope to change how people see us in the world.
Yeah. Um, when you were at the UN, I assume you had interactions with people that you probably wouldn't have if you weren't there. What we keep on seeing these votes that are like maybe 5, 6, 7 countries support Israel on the sometimes the craziest, so factually obvious untruths, and then you have like 30 countries, Western countries, that just abstain. Like, okay, we don't know, Israel might be doing genocide, they might not be doing genocide, we're just going to stay out of it. How did you survive such a place?
I did write for Ambassador Ron Purser at the United Nations, and Ambassador Purser always used to say that at the United Nations, it's not a double standard, it's a triple standard. That there's one standard for democracies, one standard for dictatorships, and this third impossible, unrealistic standard that's applied only to the state of Israel. And you see this, for example, in the Human Rights Council. It has its agenda And every year when it meets to discuss the agenda, you have agenda item number 4, which deals with the human rights violations of all the countries in the world. And then you have a standing agenda item number 7, which deals exclusively with Israel. Why, of all the countries in the world, has Israel got its own standing agenda item? It's absurd. By any measure, Israel is by far not the worst violator of human rights. It's democracy, for heaven's sake. And this is the other thing that you see at the UN. The UN is founded as a democratic institution. So every country, no matter how big or how small, how rich, how poor, how democratic or how repressive, gets a vote at the UN. And what's happening is that the majority of countries at the United Nations are not democracies. So you have 193 countries that belong to the United Nations, of which 87 or 45% are democracies. Democracies are in a minority position at the UN. And what that means is that the dictatorships abuse the democratic norms of the United Nations in order to beat up on and bully the democracies. It's really just another example of the absurdity. And you see that really happening to a lot of democracies, but in particular, it's happening to Israel. And that's a combination between a lot of countries that are actually vehemently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel and want to see it destroyed or at least weakened. But then you also have a lot of countries that I think believe, again, that this narrative about the oppressor and the oppressed and what's right and what's wrong. And it's not just that they hold Israel to a different standard, they hold the Palestinians to a different standard. They hold them to a lesser standard where they don't expect anything of them. And that in and
Yes.
of itself is a problem as well.
It's what they call in the West, a lot of people call racism of low expectations, where you're not even expecting them because they're these poor Palestinians that we can't expect them to not kill the Jews.
You
You can
treat them as
expect,
victims. You say they have
yes,
no agency. They're not responsible for their own actions. Anything that they do, slaughtering Jews, for example, is excused because, oh, those poor victims did it because ... Something we would never say for any other country.
right. Oh, do you think just, I know this is maybe not your expertise, but you were there. Do you think that it really matters? Because there's been like, or do you think also if it does matter, is there anything that we could really do, for example, to maybe make more countries support us? Does it matter if it's 10 countries or 20 countries that support us on these General Council resolutions that don't really mean a lot? Does it mean anything?
So the General Assembly, as you say, resolutions passed in the General Assembly, they're more an expression of distaste than anything else. When they're passed in the Security Council, they can actually have meaning
Yeah,
in international law. And of course, the United States sits on the Security Council and is often shielding Israel with a veto. If that were to change, there could be serious ramifications and implications for Israel. So you can sort of feel the thinness of having one protector there, which, thank God, Israel has it, but also it's not very reassuring. We saw that in the final months of the Obama administration. His exit strategy included a rebuke to Israel. So that is of concern. In terms of whether anything can be done about it, I think that when it comes to peace and security and when it comes to the Middle East, the UN is really beyond repair. And UNRWA is a classic example of that. Could you imagine that any other country would discover that UN staff participated in the massacre of their citizens and that agency would continue to exist? Never mind sending everyday donation requests and condemning Israel. But the mere fact that it's allowed to continue to exist is an absurdity.
right. And also, are you worried that now that the Biden-Harris administration is leaving, is there a chance that they'll try, or not try, are you worried that they might do what the Obama administration did in their last days? Meaning we have this letter, I know, by the defense secretary and the Secretary of State saying that Israel needs to put in more humanitarian aid to to northern Gaza, and if not, there'll be a blockade of weapons from the U.S. Will they? And I think there's a Security Council meeting in like 2 weeks about this. Are you worried that they'll maybe not block it?
I think it could actually go either way. So first of all, President Joe Biden has shown himself to be an extraordinary president and friend of Israel. And I say that in the sense that there's a lot of things that went wrong, and there's a lot of ways that he sent signals in the Middle East that I think that have made this war prolonged and more painful and more difficult and have emboldened Israel's enemies. And at the same time, he did go put himself on the ground shortly after the war started. He did send warships. He has supplied weapons and so forth. And throughout his career, his long, long career, you see that Joe Biden is a true friend of Israel and the Jewish people. So in that sense, it doesn't seem likely to me that there would be an uncomfortable surprise in the final months of his tenure. I think, if anything, the question is, would there be a final gift in the final months of his tenure? Would Joe Biden saying, we're leaving, and it's not causing a problem for somebody in my party because it's going to be the other side that enters office in January, could he potentially say that maybe now is the time to make a move against Iran's nuclear program?
Uh,
I know,
maybe, but
right?
it's
Wishful thinking.
yeah, exactly. Maybe just point. You're in America. You spend a lot of time in Israel and in the States. And if I remember correctly, you were originally from Canada, so you know Canada as well. The Jewish community and the diaspora and its relations with the Jews here in Israel. So it seemed to me, and I asked, I think Chaviv Reti Gur, I spoke to him a few days ago, and one of the things that I said was you can see it even in the US election, where in Israel they did a poll, 80% or so of Jews support Trump. And in America, the Harris, even though she probably get a little, it seems a little bit less of a Jewish vote, she'll still get most of the Jewish vote. And I'm not saying it as a bad or a good thing. Anybody has their own opinions, but it does show there's a sort of disconnect between us and them, between a lot of the Jews in the US and the Jews in Israel, maybe, on not only on the political issue, but for example, in Israel, a lot of American Jews are Reform and conservative Jews. They want for example, in the Kotel, the Western Wall, they want their where they could pray the way they like, and the Israeli government, because of political constraints, isn't letting them. There's a bunch of issues. Where do you see the disconnect? Or maybe there is not a lot of disconnect. Maybe I'm just feeling it because I'm into politics a lot.
Well, when you tell me about the disconnect between the Israeli government and young people in America, I could say to you that what about the disconnect between the Israeli government and the Israeli people, as we saw
Well,
in the streets
yes.
last night after the firing of the defense minister? So I'm not sure that that's the bar. Boundless, my nonprofit, does research to understand young American Jews and their positions, and certainly also non-Jews in their positions and understanding of Israel. We did a recent study in the summer, and what we found is that 76% of young American Jews, so that's between the ages of 18 and 40, they feel connected to Israel.
How much?
90
70?
76% feel connected to Israel. 90% say they care about Israel. Now, those figures probably surprise people because you don't get that impression. We also saw from those young Jews that a majority of them feel very uncomfortable with actions of the Israeli government and the Israeli army. So what you're seeing is that American Jews are really holding multiple sides. They care about Israel, but they're uncomfortable with Israel. We also saw that more than half of young American Jews felt unwelcome because of Israel and their Jewish identity in the places that they work and go to school and so forth. Now, that's not a surprise. That's a reaction to the anti-Semitism that's exploded after October 7th. So you have these multiple dynamics at play. They like the country. They're not happy with the way the country is prosecuting the war per se, and they're personally paying a price. And those are the dynamics that are coming into play as we're thinking about the impact of all of this on young American Jews. We also know that when it comes to the education they receive, that this is really the game-changing factor. Because if young American Jews say that they received a fair and balanced Israel education, those are the people that have the strongest connection to Israel. And what that means is that we need to be really honest about the Israel education that young people are getting. We're doing a disservice to them when we paint Israel as entirely a miracle, as entirely as perfect, because one day they're going to grow up and read the news and talk to other people and discover it is a miracle, but it's not actually perfect. And then they're going to feel like they were duped. And so the more that we're able to give them an education that's robust, that prepares them to go into the world and counter accusations that are being made, or to be able to speak in a way that demonstrates more than superficial talking points, that is really going to be the glue that makes them feel connected to Israel and a core part of their Jewish identity throughout their life.
Aviva, why did you maybe do follow-up questions of what makes them uncomfortable with the way the war is going? What exactly makes them uncomfortable?
So they've been susceptible to a lot of the rhetoric and accusations around genocide and apartheid and war crimes and, let's say, starvation of young Palestinians. What's been filtering around in the news that people have heard, they've heard it as well. And they don't have good responses, or they're unsure about it. And so
Mm.
that has really made them feel uncomfortable. And at the end of the day, the fact that people, young Jews or not, feel really uncomfortable about a war, feel really uncomfortable about the plight of the Palestinians and the people in Gaza, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That speaks to their humanity. The problem is that on all sides of this equation, people don't have the language, and we sort of eroded truth to be able to talk about, okay, there's a humanitarian problem. Is it a genocide? No, these are two separate things.
Yeah. Also, what is maybe just to understand the generational differences when you check the same poll, more or less, older American Jews are more supportive of Israel than younger ones? Is that something that?
100%, and not just true for Jews. For all across the board,
Yes.
most of the polling that we do is actually on non-Jewish audiences. And without question, the closest correlation to support for Israel has to do with age and education. The older you are, the more likely you are to support Israel. And the more education you have about Israel, but also about who are the Jewish people, what is the Jewish connection to Israel, that will also increase your favorability towards Israel.
And if we're already on the side, I didn't plan to ask you about it, but it was very interesting. Does also religious affiliation, meaning one of the things that Israel talks about a lot is the evangelical support of Israel, and in America you have a huge evangelical community. Is that something that's reflected in the polls, that the more maybe you're religious, the more you attend church, something like is that maybe can that be an indicator?
So actually, it still goes down to age. We actually do look at the evangelical community in our polling, and people are often surprised to discover that polling results, support for Israel amongst young evangelicals is low, just like every other population. So more than religion is a determining factor, age is a determining factor, which again is tied to the education that people receive.
So what you're saying is something that's very depressing, meaning that when the older generation, everyone dies at the end. So the older they get, they're less and less. There's less and less people older, and the young people, and the younger you get, the more you don't like Israel. Basically, the more you're more critical of the Jewish state, the more you buy into this oppressed reality propaganda, like we explained in the beginning. So is there any optimistic view that you have when you're looking at the numbers for future generations? Because, like, I just before you answer, we interviewed Richie Torres, Congressman Richie Torres. He's great. He's young. He's Hispanic. He's a gay. So he's someone who a lot of these people think there's, he should be on the other side, but he's very supportive of Israel. So maybe some of this is changing, or do you see it in the numbers? Anything? Some optimism here.
Oh, well, I'm not necessarily known for optimism and polling. You're exactly right. But when we look at the breakdown of numbers, we should be concerned because it's young people, particularly we look at 18 to 40, but you can break it down 18 to 24. That's where you see the greatest problem is their disconnect to Israel and their belief that Israel is committing the worst crimes. And those young people are going to become members of Congress and they're going to be business leaders who are going to make decisions about economic boycotts and they're going to be in military positions and so forth. So when we look at the future prospects, we absolutely should have some concerns. And I think in identifying this, really now at this point, the question is, what are the interventions? And it truly does come down to this ability to reclaim education.
What does it mean to you've been saying it a lot. I just want to drill down. What does it mean? How do we reach people? Because like everybody talks in Israel about hasbara. I hate that word. It's a weird word to say even. But how do we talk to people who don't maybe want to even listen? They think we're oppressors.
Yeah. So this is again research that Boundless is doing. So let's take the issue of Zionism because we used that example before. Fewer than 1/3 of Americans know what Zionism is. The implications of not knowing means that you believe the rhetoric, and the rhetoric is very dangerous to Jewish communities. So what we do at Boundless is we take this in a very data-driven approach, which says we need to figure out who are the most important constituencies in the United States that we need to be able to educate about them. And we can do that. You can use polling and message testing like you would in an election campaign. And then once you know who you want to speak to, because the first rule of communication is know your audience, then you can begin to learn. What do they know about Israel? What do they know about Zionism? What do they know about Jewish people? Where are they getting their news and information? And who has credibility? In other words, who do they believe when talking on these subjects? Those are not difficult things to be able to figure out. Once you know that, you can begin to develop messaging and educational curriculums. The challenge that we have as a Jewish community is we can do everything that I just described, but it's really not the Jewish community that needs to go and deliver it to other communities because we don't have credibility. Talking about ourselves and advocating for ourselves doesn't work. And so what we need to have is better relationships with people like Richie Torres who have credibility in the communities and demographics that you described and are able to deliver this message. And somewhere along the line in recent years, we gave up on the hard work of holding people in relationships and moved to social media. And a zinger of a social media post is not going to convince anybody of anything.
So maybe just to finish off our conversation about social media, you have a large following, I think mostly because a lot of people like you give them information on your X. That's how I found you. You give small but important information, facts. Maybe give us, first of all, like you said, is it really true that you don't really change a lot of hearts and minds through social media? And secondly, what are you, how did you get all these followers? Meaning, how does someone starting off, he or she wants to support Israel, support the Jewish community or whatever, and they want to make an impact and they're just starting off, what do they need to know? How do they do it?
Okay. So in terms of social media, the rule is if it enrages, it engages. The media platforms, they're business platforms. They're there to generate ad revenue. You generate ad revenue by keeping eyes on the screen. And the way that you keep eyes on the screen is by eliciting emotions. And the most effective emotion to keep you scrolling is anger, disgust, contempt, all these types of emotions. So the rule is if it enrages, it engages. The more vitriol, the more hate, the more disgust, the more contempt, the more engagement you will see with posts. Meaning when a post has really high engagement, it's for two reasons. People really agree or they really disagree. Now, if you step back for a moment and say, am I able to convince people in a realm like this where if they agree with me, whatever, so then what am I doing? And if they disagree with me, I'm not going to change their mind in this back and forth on social media. So the first thing we have to understand is that high engagement is not telling us about the things that we actually care about, which is if we can impact people's knowledge, their attitudes, and their behavior. What I will say is that social media, if you have a big account, it does allow you to have big reach. And there's lots of questions about who it is. All the platforms work a little bit differently. They reward different types of behavior. X wants you to post more often. LinkedIn wants you to be more professional and moderate your tone. So they're all rewarding and also punishing different behaviors in different ways. So you have to figure out what your medium is. It's very hard to start from the beginning. There's just no question about that. It takes a lot of time. My X account is more than 10 years old. I actually opened it when I was a speechwriter for Israel at the UN. One of the diplomats encouraged me, Yisrael Nitzan, he encouraged me to open it. And I said, no, I don't think so. Nobody needs to hear from me online. And then not that long ago, he reached out to me and he said to me, I see your account has grown a lot. We created a monster, but at least you're our monster. Yeah. And at least that's true. I am at least our monster. So
I just want to maybe just one more question about that. Do you think so basically what you're saying is that there's really not a lot of people, even if it's getting a lot of likes or a lot of shares, a lot of retweets, whatever each platform calls it, or even a lot of views, it doesn't mean that it's even changing one person's mind, because it's either getting people who agree with it anyway before to just watch it and get all excited because they agree, or it's getting people to curse you out and be very angry at what you're saying. But people in the middle, they're just scrolling by because it's nothing to do with them, right?
Or it's not making it to their feed at all because it's not their content area. I will say that there is one thing that I do know that it is doing, which is that a lot of Jewish people are feeling very scared and very alone in this moment. A lot of Israelis feel the same way. They feel isolated and misunderstood in the world. And so the one thing that I do know that my account does, and other accounts like mine that are spending a lot of time calling out disgusting acts of Jew hatred, advocating for the hostages, fighting misinformation and disinformation that's targeting Israel, is that it gives language to other Jewish people that look around and say, what is this insanity and how am I supposed to answer it? So for them, it helps. And it makes them realize that they're not alone in this fight. There are a lot of us that are going out to bat every single day to advocate for Israel and the Jewish people, and we're not going to stop.
Lastly, we mentioned the U.S. election. You're in America. Do you,
And
as someone we're talking to, you're sitting in America, but as someone who,
yes,
yeah, as someone who is sitting there while this craziness, this political turmoil is happening in America, do you think? Are you optimistic, I'll ask this, about the way Jews approach the election? So it seems to me that, irregardless of opinion about the outcome, again, is that a lot of Jews said to themselves, we need to take this election. We can't take it for granted. Our vote matters, and we're going to make the candidates work for it more than they did in the past. So it seemed to me like in a lot of, especially the swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and other places, a lot of the Jews met with candidates more than in the past. They were more reluctant to give support, for example, to Jews traditionally voted Democrat. They made the Democrat, even if they voted in the end for it, work for it harder. They made it a little bit more. It seemed to me, maybe I'm just looking from afar because I'm reading, the media stuff. But do you agree with what I'm saying?
I think that American Jews feel more vulnerable in America than they have in their lifetime, and that there's no question that this colored this election. We're here the morning after the election. There is a definitive winner. Donald Trump will be the
Right.
next president of the United States. We can see the polling. We know that Jews still majority voted for Democrats, but more went and voted for Republican than we've seen in previous elections. And I do think that's a response to what you've seen really take over in the United States, which is this catering to a progressive wing that is allowing champions of terrorist organizations to go marching through these streets, to stand outside of synagogues wearing keffiyehs to hide their face and to scream genocidal chants against Jews. And that the Jewish people are saying, I'm uncomfortable for myself, I'm uncomfortable for my children, and I'm going to go ahead and demand better this time around.
And so that's why it was the Democrat got less support, I think, than in a lot decades for a Democrat candidate. And you're saying that maybe a lot of it had to do with a sort of feeling that maybe the Democrats didn't take these threats seriously or catered even to these voices that were, well, there are Democrat congresswomen, the squad, who are, I think we can say, just openly anti-Semitic. Rashida Tlaib, Ilan Omar, and my father's congressional seat is a neighboring with AOC. So, I mean, there is a problem, I think, in the younger generation of the Democrat Party that this fight. On the other hand, we have Richie Torres that we spoke about. So there's sort of a battle for the soul of the Democrats, right?
This was a close election, and I think that the Democratic Party felt like they didn't want to lose anybody. And so they were trying to be all things to all people, and they were trying to hold on to the progressive wing of the party. And the result was they didn't say things that they should have said. The most common sense, most decent thing to say, which is that the people that are marching through the streets, they may be expressing their right to free speech as protected under the Constitution here in the United States, but it's disgusting and it's appalling. It doesn't represent my values. It doesn't represent the values of the Democratic Party. I
Yeah.
honestly believe that if the leadership of the Democrats had had the courage to say that, it really would have made people think twice. But if you don't even have the courage to say it, then we know you'll never have the courage to do anything about it.
Yes, one of the things I wanted to say, which is I kept on writing about it on I have a lot less social media, but people that follow me, but I like writing stuff that because I write in the newspaper too, so I guess we're evened out. But it almost seemed to me that it's like they kept on saying, we have the right for free speech, like you just said. There's no the president came out and said, and Kamala Harris came out and said, you can't damage property, you can't be violent. Everybody knows this. It should be like an obvious thing. The question I think that everybody was waiting to hear is, what do you have to say to the actual content of what they're saying? Let's say it was
And
all
also,
people.
and to enforce it, you can
Right, right,
say,
right.
don't
Obviously.
burn the American flag or stop vandalizing American monuments. But if there's no enforcement measures, if nobody takes that seriously, we don't see them
Yes.
stop. We didn't see
But
them stop.
yeah, I felt even more than that is that you should be able to, on such a, it's so clear cut morally. There's a terrorist organization that's, you know, raping women, going to peaceful communities and just destroying them, and then you have another and kidnapping people in a democracy that's fighting it with, like you said, not perfect, but still, you can't. One is a terrorist organization, the other one's a country, and you can't tell people that are protesting in favor of the terrorist organization that they're wrong. You can't bring yourself to say that. Something is deeply rotten if you feel that's a controversial position. It shouldn't be.
I think the Democrats have a lot of soul searching to do.
Yes. Aviva Klompas, it was a pleasure talking to you. I like picking brains of people who know what's happening in America, because sometimes it's so, you get like very weird, half pictures. You don't. So I think I'm coming out of the conversation being very depressed, but hopefully, like you said, working on the stuff that you guys do and other people that are doing important jobs, maybe we can help out and bring awareness to you and to your work through here. So
I
thank
would
you so much,
appreciate
Aviva.
that. And I just started a new podcast. I'm recording twice a week with Dr. Michael Oren. Fantastic conversations about what's in the headlines and how it affects both Israelis, but also Jews here in America. And it's called Boundless Insights.
Yeah, we mentioned it at the top, and Michael Oren's coming on, so I'll mention it when he comes on the next time. So
Amazing.
thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Western Spirit podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time.